Well, well, well. Look what the cat dragged in. The voice cut through the quiet, opulent hum of the New York private airport lounge like a shard of glass. Elara Hayes felt the blood drain from her face, her entire body going rigid. It was a voice she heard in her nightmares, a smooth, condescending baritone that had once whispered promises and had later spat acidic insults. She had prayed she would never hear it in person again. Her hands, which had been trembling slightly around a cup of lukewarm coffee, were suddenly frozen. She felt a cold, paralyzing dread creep up her spine, locking her in place. She didn't need to turn around. She knew exactly who it was. Before we find out what Elara did next, make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications on. You will not want to miss the moment this story explodes. Elara slowly, mechanically, lifted her head. There, he was. Marcus, her ex-husband, stood not 10 feet away, radiating an aura of smug, expensive superiority. He was dripping in arrogance and a tailored silk suit that probably cost more than her entire year's rent. He looked offensively handsome, his dark hair perfectly styled, his smile a bright, predatory slash. Clinging to his arm was Jessica, the woman he had left her for. Jessica was young, vapid, and poured into a designer tracksuit that screamed new money. She looked at Elara with a mixture of confusion and boredom, as if she were a piece of furniture that was out of place. Marcus sauntered over, his expensive shoes silent on the plush carpet, and stopped directly in front of her chair, forcing Elara to crane her neck to look up at him. "Elara, darling," he said, drawing out her name with mocking sweetness. "I have to say, I am absolutely shocked to see you here. This is the executive lounge, you know. Did you get lost on your way to the food court over in the main terminal?" Jessica let out a high-pitched, tinkling laugh. "Oh, Marcus, don't be mean," she cooed, though her eyes were anything but kind. "Maybe she's working here now. It's good, honest work. Someone has to wipe down the tables." Elara felt her face burn with a hot, sickening wave of shame. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she was afraid it would break through. This was not happening. Not here, not today. Today was supposed to be her day, the culmination of 2 years of silent, agonizing work. She was sitting in this lounge, feeling like a complete imposter, clutching a simple paper confirmation for a flight to Geneva. Today was the day her new company, Phoenix Systems, was set to be acquired by the global behemoth, Orion Dynamics. It was a deal that would make her one of the wealthiest and most powerful women in tech. It was the day her new life was supposed to start. And now, here was the ghost of her past, risen to remind her of what he thought she was. Nothing. Still the quiet little mouse, I see, Marcus scoffed, shaking his head with faux pity. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the entire lounge to hear. "Seriously, Elara. Look at you. Same drab clothes. Same sad little expression. Life not treating you so well after me, is it? I mean, what are you even doing here? You can't possibly afford the membership fee, let alone a flight out of this place." He gestured dramatically to himself and Jessica. "We, on the other hand, are on our way to Aspen. Just a quick celebratory trip. Apex Solutions just closed another massive round of funding. We're talking 9 figures. The investors are throwing a huge party for us on the mountain." He grinned, showing all of his perfectly white teeth. "But you probably read about that. We're about to go stratospheric." Elara hadn't read about it. The only news she followed about Apex Solutions, the company she had co-founded and built from scratch, was its steadily declining stock price. She knew, from back-channel sources, that Marcus was hemorrhaging cash. His vision had run the company she built into the ground. He wasn't here celebrating a new round. He was likely on his way to beg a minor investor for a bridge loan just to make payroll. He was, as he had always been, a magnificent liar. "But enough about my success," he continued, clearly enjoying the spectacle he was creating. The few other occupants of the lounge were now staring, their faces a mixture of pity for her and annoyance at him. "What about you, Elara? What brings you to the big leagues? Finally land a new guy. Does he have a decent enough bonus to fly you charter?" He laughed, a loud, braying sound that made her wince. This was the man she had loved. This was the man she had given her genius to. She had been the brilliant, introverted coder at MIT, and he had been the charismatic business student who saw the value in her revolutionary machine learning algorithm. "You're the engine, Elle," he used to say. "I'm the steering wheel. Together, we'll own the world." And they almost had. She had dropped her PhD to co-found Apex Solutions with him. She had coded for 20 hours a day, fueled by cheap pizza and a burning desire to create. He had taken her code, her engine, and charmed investors, given TED Talks on her work, and graced the covers of business magazines as the visionary tech genius. He had convinced her to put all their joint assets, all their stock, into a complex holding company he controlled. "It's just smarter for tax purposes, darling," he had assured her. And she, lost in the beauty of her algorithms, had trusted him completely. Then came Jessica. Then came the late nights, the lies, and the brutal, public divorce. His lawyers, funded by the company she had created, had painted her as a bitter, unsupportive, and replaceable employee. They had argued that her algorithm, while clever, was just a small piece of the puzzle. The real value, they claimed, was in Marcus' vision and brand building. He had kept everything: the company, the house in the Hamptons, the art collection, and their social circle. She was left with a modest cash settlement, just enough to silence her, and a single, obscure patent she had filed on her own years before. A side project Marcus had dismissed as boring and commercially worthless. A footnote, Elara. That's all you were. The words he had spat at her during the final deposition echoed in her head. "You were just the code monkey in the basement. I built that company. I made you relevant. And without me, you're just nothing." Now, looking at his smug, handsome face, she felt that old, familiar wave of pain and despair. The trembling in her hands returned. Worse this time, she felt small. She felt worthless. She felt like the footnote he had declared her to be. For a terrifying second, she believed him. Maybe this whole Orion Dynamics deal was a fluke, a dream she was about to wake up from. Maybe she really was just a sad woman in a drab cardigan who had gotten lost on her way to the food court. "Ricky," Jessica whined, pulling on his arm. "This is boring. You're getting her sad sack germs on your suit. Let's go get our champagne." "In a minute, baby," Marcus said, patting her hand but never taking his eyes off Elara. He couldn't stand it. He was probing for that familiar reaction, the one he was so good at getting. He needed to see her cry. He needed to see her break, to reconfirm his dominance. And it was, in that moment, seeing the desperate, needy hunger in his eyes, that something inside Elara shifted. The searing heat of her humiliation, the sharp, stabbing pain of his betrayal, didn't break her. It began to solidify. The trembling in her hands didn't just stop. It was replaced by a profound, sudden stillness. The tears that had threatened to well in her eyes receded, turning into a cold, dry frost. The hammering in her chest slowed, each beat now a slow, heavy, deliberate thud. The pain was still there, but it had changed. It had transformed. It was no longer the all-consuming fire of a victim. It was the ice-cold, precise rage of a survivor. It was the calm, analytical focus of a scientist observing a problem. And Marcus, she realized with a sudden, shocking clarity, was a problem she had already solved. She had spent the last 2 years in a tiny New York apartment, living on instant noodles and the last of her settlement money. She had taken that worthless patent, the one he and his high-priced lawyers had let her keep out of pity, and she had nurtured it in secret. She had worked in total isolation, pouring her grief, her rage, and her genius into building Phoenix systems. She hadn't just replicated her old work. She had perfected it. She had created an algorithm so powerful, so revolutionary, it would change global logistics forever. And Marcus, in his infinite arrogance, had left her with the one thing that could not only make her a billionaire but could also destroy him utterly. Elara took a slow, deep breath, letting it out evenly. She finally met his gaze. Her eyes, which had been downcast and fearful only a moment before, were now steady, clear, and as cold as a winter sky. She did not speak. She simply stared, letting the silence stretch, watching the confusion start to flicker behind his arrogant smirk. He was waiting for the mouse, but the mouse was gone. A dragon was looking back at him, and he was too stupid to even see it. Marcus's smirk wavered, replaced by a flicker of genuine confusion. He was a bully, and bullies operate on a simple feedback loop. They require fear, tears, or anger. This cold, silent void she was projecting was not in his playbook. He had come over expecting to crush a butterfly, and found himself facing a block of granite. "What?" he said, his voice losing some of its booming confidence. "Cat, got your tongue now? Nothing to say for yourself? Pathetic." His words, pathetic, footnote, code monkey, echoed in her head, the sound of them sending her spiraling back through the years of pain to the very beginning. The sting of his arrogance today was a perfect mirror of the man he had become, but it was the memory of the man he had been, or at least pretended to be, that had disarmed her for so long. The image of the opulent lounge dissolved, replaced by the damp, fluorescent-lit hum of a computer lab at MIT, nearly a decade ago. She had been a graduate student, her entire world contained within the glowing lines of code on her screen. She was building a neural network thesis, so complex her professors struggled to keep up. She lived on cafeteria coffee, and the electric thrill of pure logic. She was brilliant, she was invisible, and she had been, for the most part, content with that. Then Marcus had walked in. He wasn't part of the engineering department. He was a business student, cutting a swath through the campus with a dazzling smile and a confidence that bordered on blinding. He hadn't just approached her, fumbling and awkward like her engineering peers. He had sat down at her terminal as if he owned it, his eyes sparkling with a predatory intelligence. "I hear you're the one who can actually make this stuff work," he had said, gesturing to her screen full of complex algorithms. "Not just talk about it, but build it." He didn't understand her work, not really. He never would. He didn't speak the language of code, but he understood the language of power, and he immediately recognized that her work was the key to a kingdom. He listened, rapt, as she explained her theories on machine learning and predictive behavior. He didn't care about the how, only the what. What it could do, what it was worth. "We're a team, Elle," he used to say, back when his eyes still seemed genuine, back when he still called her Elle. "You're the engine. I'm the steering wheel. We'll go places no one has even dreamed of." He was so persuasive. He had a golden tongue that could sell sand in a desert, and he sold her on a future. He convinced her to drop her PhD, a decision that had horrified her cautious, academic parents. "This is a once-in-a-lifetime shot, Elle," he had argued. "The world is moving too fast. We have to build this now. Don't you want to change the world?" She, who had only wanted to solve the puzzle, was suddenly captivated by his vision. So, she agreed. They married in a simple courthouse ceremony between funding pitches. They co-founded Apex Solutions. The first 2 years were a blur of all-nighters, cheap pizza, and the shared, frantic thrill of creation. Elara coded. She built the entire platform from the ground up, her fingers flying across the keyboard, creating a digital soul. Marcus pitched. He took the magic she was spinning and wove it into a narrative that enchanted investors. They were a perfect team. She was the architect, happy to remain in the shadows, and he was the face, thriving in the spotlight. The change was gradual, then sudden. The first round of funding, $5 million, had felt like a victory. The second, $50 million, felt like a shift. The steering wheel was starting to believe it was the entire car. He started referring to her work as our work. Then, in interviews, it became my work. He was the one on stage at tech conferences, the one on the cover of business magazines, hailed as the next great American visionary. Elara, who hated the spotlight anyway, was content to stay in the background, to build, to solve, to make the engine more powerful. She was the chief technology officer, but it was a title that became increasingly meaningless. She would try to speak in board meetings, to explain the technical nuances, and Marcus would cut her off with an indulgent laugh. "Elara's getting into the weeds again," he would charm the room. "She's our brilliant scientist. Let me give you the 30,000-foot view," and he would proceed to repackage her data and her breakthroughs as his grand strategy. She had let it happen. She told herself it was fine. He was good at this part, the talking, the selling. She was good at the work. She was the foundation. But she had forgotten that in an earthquake, the foundation is the first thing to crack. The final, devastating betrayal hadn't been Jessica. It had been the paperwork. As the company's valuation soared toward $1 billion, Marcus had come to her, his face a mask of serious, husbandly concern. "Elle, our finances are a mess," he had said, spreading a mountain of legal documents across their kitchen island. "We have all our stock, the house, our personal assets, all tied up in separate accounts. It's a huge liability. My lawyers, the new ones from the firm, they've drafted a new holding company. It's smarter for tax purposes. It protects us. We just roll everything into it. He had pointed to the signature lines. She, who could model quantum data in her sleep, found herself utterly lost in the dense forest of corporate legal jargon. She was in the middle of a critical code crunch, sleeping 4 hours a night. She trusted him. He was her husband, he was her partner. It's smarter for tax purposes, he had assured her, guiding her hand. It just makes everything clean. It was the single greatest mistake of her life. She had signed it all away. She had, in her trusting, naive brilliance, handed him the keys to the entire kingdom she had built. She had handed him the company, her stock, their home, and all their joint assets, all legally bundled into a corporate entity that he, and he alone, controlled. Back in the lounge, Elara's eyes were still locked on his. The old, familiar sting of that betrayal, the memory of her own staggering naivety, burned away the last vestiges of the woman she had been. He was still talking, his voice a low, insulting buzz. He was calling her a charity case, a joke. But she was no longer listening to his words. She was listening to the echo of her past, a past that had forged her in fire and ice. He had made her a footnote in his story, but he had made a fatal error. He had left her with a pen, and she was about to write her own. Marcus's frustration was now visible. His smile tightened, becoming more of a snarl. This wasn't the reaction he had paid for. He needed her to be the victim he remembered, the weeping, broken woman he had discarded. Her cold, unwavering silence was an act of defiance he couldn't comprehend. Nothing to say, he pressed, his voice getting louder, attracting more unwanted attention. That's fine, you were never good at talking anyway. That's what you had me for, remember, you were just the quiet little nerd in the basement, fiddling with your numbers. You're lucky I gave you a life at all, Elara. You should be thanking me. His words, meant to cut, were hollow. They no longer had any power over her. Her mind, now sharp and clear, was already elsewhere. It had drifted to the one, singular mistake he had made, the one loose thread his army of lawyers had missed. She remembered the day she filed the patent. It had been a rainy Saturday, almost 3 years before the divorce. She was at home, while Marcus was, as usual, networking, at some golf tournament. She had been toying with a side project, a purely academic curiosity. She had wondered if her predictive algorithm, which was so good at modeling human consumer behavior, could be applied to something more complex, more chaotic. Like the global supply chain, she saw a beautiful equation in the movement of cargo ships, weather patterns, port congestion, and manufacturing delays. It was a fascinating puzzle. She spent a weekend writing the core code, a logistics application for her AI. It was an elegant, brilliant piece of work. On Monday, she had paid the small filing fee with her personal credit card and filed the patent under her own name, Elara Hayes, not Apex Solutions. It was just a little thing, something for her, a small piece of intellectual property that was hers and hers alone. She had even shown it to Marcus, excited by the sheer complexity of the problem she had solved. He had looked at her screen, his eyes glazing over as he saw the strings of data instead of a flashy user interface. He had actually laughed, a short, dismissive chuckle. Logistics, seriously. Trucks and boxes, it's boring. It's a low-margin, high-drag industry. Stick to the moneymaker, darling. Stick to what we know. Consumer data is sexy. That's where the real money is. He had tapped her screen. This is just an academic project. It's commercially worthless. Don't waste your time on it. She, embarrassed, had archived the file. But she never withdrew the patent. It was her worthless little secret. The memory of that dismissal was sharp, but it was immediately followed by a darker one. The boring logistics code had been forgotten, because that was when his real betrayal had begun. It wasn't just the corporate theft, it was the human one. The late nights he claimed were investor dinners, the sudden, obsessive focus on his appearance, the new expensive gym membership, the teeth whitening, and then, the scent. A cloyingly sweet, cheap-smelling perfume that wasn't hers, clinging to the silk lapels of his suits. She remembered the night she found the hotel receipt, not from a business trip, a hotel just across town. She had confronted him, not with rage, but with a hollow, trembling sickness in her stomach. She had held up the paper, her hand shaking. "Marcus, what is this?" He hadn't even had the decency to look ashamed. He had looked relieved. The mask of the charming, devoted husband had finally dropped, and the man underneath was a cold, ruthless stranger. "It just happened, Elara," he'd said with a sigh, as if he were discussing a dip in the stock market. "Her name is Jessica. She understands the pressure I'm under. She supports my vision. She doesn't question me." The floor had dropped out from under her. "And I don't," she had whispered, the words barely audible. "I don't support you, Marcus. I wrote the vision." That was when he had snapped. The cold indifference vanished, replaced by a sudden, venomous spite. "You wrote the code," he spat, his voice a low hiss. "The code is just a tool. It's replaceable. I'm not. You're holding me back, Elara. You and your constant questions, your endless weeds, you're a weight, and I'm done carrying you." The divorce was not a legal proceeding. It was a public execution. His lawyers, the best in New York, funded by the company she had created, systematically dismantled her life's work. They painted her as a bitter, replaceable cog. They used her introverted nature, her hatred of the spotlight, as proof of her minor role. "She was a simple employee, Your Honor, nothing more," the lead attorney had said, his face a mask of patronizing pity. They twisted her old emails, her project notes, and presented them as directives she had been given by Marcus. He was the visionary. She was the disgruntled technician. When it came to the assets, it was a massacre. The holding company she had so blindly signed, the one smarter for tax purposes, had legally transferred all her shares, her stake in the company, and her ownership of their joint property to him. She had, with a single stroke of a pen, given him everything. She remembered her lawyer trying to claw something back for her. "What about this patent, Your Honor?" he had said, holding up the file for her boring logistics AI. This, at least, was filed in Miss Hayes's name alone. Marcus's lead attorney, a man with a vampire's smile, had literally scoffed, leaning back in his chair. "Your Honor, Miss Hayes is welcome to her little academic project. It's a non-commercial, theoretical piece of work. It has zero market value. We, on the other hand, will be keeping the multi-billion-dollar enterprise." The judge, blinded by Marcus's charisma and the mountain of fabricated evidence, had agreed. Marcus was awarded the company, the house, the art, the network. Elara was awarded a modest cash settlement, just enough to ensure she wouldn't starve, but not enough to ever be a threat and a gag order preventing her from ever discussing her role as a founder of Apex Solutions. And, of course, she was allowed to keep her worthless little patent. She remembered walking out of the courtroom, numb, her ears ringing. She took a taxi to a tiny, sublet studio apartment in a walk-up building. She had closed the door, the cheap lock clicking shut. And for the first time in her life, the woman who lived in a world of pure, cold logic, had shattered. She didn't just cry. She wailed. She collapsed onto the thin, stained carpet and screamed into it, raw, animal sounds of grief, until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen shut. She was mourning the loss of her husband, the man she had loved since she was a girl. She was mourning the loss of her company, her life's work, the very thing she had built from nothing. She was mourning the loss of her name. He had taken it all. Now, standing in the luxurious lounge, listening to that same man call her a footnote, the memory of that breakdown echoed in her. The humiliation he was trying to heap on her now was nothing. It was a child's insult compared to the sound of her own screams in that empty apartment. She had already survived the worst thing he could do to her. This was just noise. He looked at her, his face turning an ugly shade of red from her continued silence. "What, are you deaf? Or just too stupid to?" "I'm waiting for a flight, Marcus," she said. Her voice, when it finally came, was not the one he remembered. It wasn't the trembling whisper of his victim or the quiet murmur of his code monkey. It was quiet, yes, but it was as clear and as cold as a bell. It cut through his tirade, and he finally, blessedly, shut up. Marcus was so startled by the sound of her voice that he actually took a half-step back. It was not the voice he had been trying to provoke. It held no tears, no fear, no pleading. It was just a statement. He recovered quickly, his arrogance rushing back in to fill the vacuum of his confusion. He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound like tearing paper. "A flight," he repeated, as if she had just told a particularly stupid joke. "A flight. Oh, that's rich, Elara. Really? Where are you going, huh? A weekend trip to see your parents in Ohio. Did you cash in your credit card points for a middle seat on a budget airline? Is that what this is? You're pretending to be in the executive lounge until they call general boarding." Jessica giggled. "Ricky, that's so mean. Maybe she won a contest." "Right, a contest," Marcus sneered, his eyes scanning her simple, practical beige cardigan as if it were a personal insult. "Look, Elara, whatever pathetic little game you're playing, just stop. It's embarrassing. You're embarrassing yourself. You had your one little shot at the big leagues, and you had it with me. You were my code monkey, and now, you're this. Just accept it. Know your place." His words, "know your place," were meant to be the killing blow, the final reminder of her status as a footnote. But they had the opposite effect. They were a trigger, and they sent her mind hurtling back, not to the pain of the divorce, but to the days immediately after. She had spent one full week on the floor of that tiny, sublet apartment, wailing into a pillow until her throat was raw. She had grieved the loss of her husband, her company, and her life's work with a primal, animalistic intensity. She had allowed the grief to consume her, to burn through her system like a fever. And on the 8th day, she woke up. The grief was still there, but it was no longer a storm. It was a cold, heavy stone in her stomach. She got up, took a shower, made a cup of instant coffee, and opened her laptop. Her fingers had trembled over the keyboard. Her old life was gone. Her Apex email was deactivated. Her professional network was now Marcus's, and they had all, to a person, sided with the visionary, not the technician. She was alone. She was a pariah. She had her small settlement, which, after paying her own legal fees, would barely last her 2 years if she was frugal. She had her clothes, a few books, and her laptop. And she had the patent. She opened the file, the one marked Logistics, AI, Draft. She stared at the complex mathematical proofs, the elegant, streamlined code she had written on that rainy Saturday. Marcus's voice echoed in her head. "Boring. Worthless. Stick to the moneymaker." A slow, cold anger began to burn away the last fog of her grief. It was an anger so pure and so quiet it felt like an electric current. He was wrong. It wasn't boring, it was brilliant. He hadn't dismissed it because it was worthless. He had dismissed it because he didn't, and couldn't, understand it. Consumer behavior was easy. It was simple. This was the movement of the entire physical world. It was a problem 100 times more complex, and therefore, 100 times more valuable. And in his infinite, godlike arrogance, he had handed it to her. He and his vampire lawyers had laughed as they gave her the one, single weapon that could not only destroy him but build her an empire. From that day on, she was a ghost. She did not go out. She did not see friends, not that any called. She founded Phoenix Systems from a second-hand desk she'd bought for $30, wedged into the corner of her studio apartment. Her office was her laptop. Her boardroom was the local coffee shop with free Wi-Fi, where she would nurse a single black coffee for 5 hours. She lived on instant noodles and the last of her dwindling settlement, pouring every spare cent into server costs and data licenses. She worked for 18 months. 18 months of relentless, silent, soul-crushing work, fueled by rage and coffee. She worked in total isolation. She had learned her lesson. She would never again share her work, her code, her soul, with anyone. She built firewalls around her firewalls. She encrypted her data with a methodology she invented herself. She didn't just rebuild her old algorithm, she perfected it. She made it stronger, faster, smarter, and more secure than anything she had ever built for Apex. She was no longer just a coder. She was a founder. She was an architect. And this time, she was building a fortress, and she was the only one with the keys. When the platform was stable, when it was perfect, she did not seek venture capital. She knew that world. It was Marcus's world. A world of smug, like-minded men who would just see her as another code monkey and try to install their own visionary CEO on top of her. No. She needed a different kind of partner. She needed a shark, not a salesman. She had used her last $1,000 not on rent, but to hire a private investigator, a former signals intelligence analyst, to find one thing: the personal, encrypted inbox of Mr. Vance. Mr. Vance, the reclusive, legendary, and terrifying CEO of Orion Dynamics, Vance was the anti-Marcus. He was a pure technologist, an engineer by trade who had built a global empire on technology that actually worked, not just on hype. He was a man famous for firing executives on the spot for using buzzwords. He detested the kind of visionary salesman that Marcus pretended to be. He was ruthless, he was brilliant, and he was the only person on Earth who would understand what she had built. She crafted a single, perfect email. It was not a sales pitch. It had no narrative, no charm, no 30,000-foot view. It was a data-driven demonstration of pure, irrefutable power. It was 20 lines of text, explaining in the coldest, most logical terms what her AI, Phoenix, could do, and it contained a single, secure link to a sandbox demonstration, showing how her platform could analyze global shipping routes, weather patterns, manufacturing chains, and political instability in real time, predicting and rerouting supply chains with 99.8% efficiency. It was a program that could save a company like Orion Dynamics, not millions, but billions. She hit send. And then she waited, her heart hammering, feeling sicker than she had on her divorce day. This was not a shot in the dark. This was her final, single, desperate flare. If he didn't respond, she was done. She would be, truly, a footnote. The reply came 6 hours later. It was not from an assistant. It was from him. It contained 5 words. My office. Zurich. Tomorrow. Be there. Orion Dynamics had sent a car to her walk-up apartment. They had flown her, not in a G700, but in first class, to Switzerland. She had walked into a boardroom that overlooked the Alps, her hands shaking, clutching her laptop. Mr. Vance was not a young man. He was in his late 60s, with sharp, intelligent, merciless eyes that seemed to see right through her beige cardigan to the code beneath. She didn't give a sales pitch. She just opened her laptop and ran the demonstration. For 2 hours, she spoke the language of data, of architecture, of predictive decay algorithms. Vance and his team of hardened, veteran engineers watched in total silence. They didn't ask about profit margins or marketing. They asked about her data modeling, her encryption, her server architecture. It was the most thrilling, terrifying, and validating conversation of her entire life. At the end, Vance had closed her laptop for her. He had looked at her, his face unreadable. Miss Hayes. You have not built a better logistics program. You have solved the problem of global freight. What do you want? Her voice had shaken, but it had not broken. I want to build. I want to see this work. And, she had added, the stone of her anger in her stomach, I want to ensure that Apex Solutions never benefits from a single line of my code again. Vance had nodded, a thin, cold smile playing on his lips. Apex, Davenport's company. A ghost ship. They've been trying to win our logistics contract for a year, pitching us the very technology you invented, only they can't make it work. They're irrelevant. The negotiations had been swift. He hadn't just offered to buy her program. He had offered to acquire Phoenix Systems for a number so large it looked like a typo. He would make her the director of a new, autonomous division, Orion Global Dynamics. The deal was staggering. It was generational wealth. It was power. It was, quite simply, the world. And today, this flight to Geneva was the final signing. Elara's thoughts snapped back to the present. The entire, brutal, secret 2-year journey flooded back into her, washing away the last of her fear. Marcus was still talking. He was on a roll now, performing for the lounge. So I'm serious, Elara. What is it? A propeller plane to Poughkeepsie. A bus ticket to Atlantic City. You can tell me. I'm feeling generous. I might even buy you a real drink before you go. He was so loud, so arrogant, and so utterly, completely blind. He was a king, standing on a trapdoor, mocking the woman who held the lever. Elara felt something new. It wasn't anger. It wasn't pain. It was pity. He was pathetic. He was a footnote in her story. She finally looked away from him, breaking the intense eye contact. She looked down at the simple paper confirmation in her trembling hand. No, her hand wasn't trembling anymore. It was perfectly, completely still. Something like that, Marcus, she said, her voice quiet again. But this time, it was laced with a finality that was as cold and as sharp as a razor. She just had to wait. She just had to get on that plane. Marcus's reaction to her quiet, dismissive something like that was predictable. He exploded in a harsh, braying laugh. He had been expecting a fight, or tears, or a confession of her failure. Her calm indifference was, to him, the ultimate sign of her delusion, of her complete break from the reality he controlled. Something like that, he mimicked, his voice dripping with venomous amusement. "Oh, Elara. You're even sadder than I thought. You're so broken you've actually started to believe your own pathetic fantasies." He pointed a manicured finger out the massive floor-to-ceiling window, toward the tarmac. "You see that jet out there? The Citation 10. That's my jet. Brand new. $10 million. That's what real success looks like. That's my ride to Aspen." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial hiss, but his eyes were bright with malice for the whole room to see. "So, you tell me, what's your ride, Elara? Is it the number 7 bus to the Port Authority? You're a joke. You're a charity case sitting in a room you don't belong in, pretending you have a flight." He was in the middle of his triumphant, scathing monologue, his face flushed with his own perceived brilliance, when a new sound began. It was not a sound, at first. It was a vibration. It was a deep, chest-thrumming bass note that Elara felt in her teeth. Then it grew, a low, powerful whine that completely eclipsed the ambient hum of the lounge and the distant, tinny sound of smaller aircraft. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated power. It was the sound of a predator. Marcus stopped talking, mid-insult, his mouth hung open. "What in the hell is that?" Jessica whined, her hands flying up to cover her ears. "Ricky, make it stop." But Marcus was staring, frozen, at the window. Elara, however, did not need to look. She knew that sound. She had been waiting for it. It was the sound of her new life. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her now cold coffee. She felt the ice-cold calm in her veins turn into a slow, warm thrum of pure, undeniable victory. She finally turned her head, slowly, and looked out the window. It was magnificent. Gliding past the line of smaller, serviceable jets was a Gulfstream G700. It was not just a plane, it was a statement. It was a sleek, pearlescent white, with a wingspan so wide it looked like a raptor. It moved with a silent, terrifying grace. It taxied onto the apron and came to a stop, its engines winding down with a soft, expensive sigh. And it parked directly, intentionally, next to Marcus's brand new Citation 10. The comparison was laughable. It was beyond humiliating. Marcus's $10 million jet, his symbol of ultimate success, looked like a cheap, plastic child's toy parked next to a $90 million intercontinental missile. The G700 was longer, taller, and radiated an aura of global power that made the Citation look like a regional puddle jumper. On its high, sweeping tail was a simple, stylized silver O, the logo of Orion Dynamics. The lounge, which had been discreetly ignoring Marcus's tirade, was now in a state of collective, stunned silence. Everyone was staring at the Gulfstream. "Oh my God," Jessica breathed, her face pressed against the glass. "Ricky, who is that? That's bigger than the one the Kardashians use. Is that a movie star? Is it a prince?" Marcus was silent. His face had gone pale. He knew planes, and he knew that plane. He knew what it represented. That aircraft was not for show-offs like him. It was for the titans. It was for the billionaires and heads of state who didn't type, go, and it would cross the planet without stopping. It was a level of wealth and power he had only ever pretended to achieve, and its mere presence was an insult to his carefully crafted image. At that exact moment, a new figure entered the lounge from the private reception area. He was not a passenger. He was a man in his 40s, tall, with the build of a former Special Forces operator, poured into a flawless, dark, severe suit that probably cost $5,000. He radiated an aura of quiet, lethal competence. His eyes, the color of slate, scanned the room once, his gaze flicking over Marcus and Jessica as if they were pieces of uninteresting furniture. His eyes landed on Elara. He walked directly to her, his expensive shoes making no sound on the plush carpet. The entire room, including the lounge attendants, held its breath. He stopped directly in front of her chair. He did not smile. He simply gave a slight, correct, and deeply respectful nod. Director Hayes. Elara felt her heart give a single, powerful thud. It was the first time she had heard the title said to her in public. It was real. She had imagined this moment, but the reality of it, the simple, profound respect, was more potent than she could have ever dreamed. She nodded back, her voice steady. "Mr. Sterling." "Mr. Vance sends his apologies," the man said, his voice a low, professional monotone. "He was unavoidably held up in Singapore. He will meet you directly in Geneva. The aircraft is ready for you, if you are." "Thank you, Mr. Sterling." "I'm ready," Elara said. She stood up. Her movements were not rushed. They were deliberate. She bent down and picked up her simple, worn canvas tote bag, the one that held her laptop, a change of clothes, and the printed confirmation of her new life. She slung it over her shoulder, and she turned. The entire lounge was staring at her. The man in the pinstripe suit who had pitied her earlier now had his Wall Street Journal lowered, his mouth slightly agape. And then, there was Marcus. His face was a portrait of pure, unadulterated horror. The blood had drained from it, so completely he looked gray, sickly. The arrogant smirk, the mocking laughter, it hadn't just faded. It had shattered, like a mirror dropped on concrete. It was replaced by a gaping, slack-jawed look of panicked, screaming confusion. His eyes darted from Elara, to the impossibly composed Mr. Sterling, to the G700 on the tarmac, the one with the massive Orion logo, and then back to Elara. The pieces were clicking in his head, but they were forming a picture that his brain simply could not, would not, accept. "Director Hayes," he choked out, the words strangling him. He was trembling. "He called you." "Director." Elara simply looked at him. She had nothing to say. There were no words left for him. She prepared to walk past him, to leave him in the ruins of his own arrogance and follow Mr. Sterling to her future. But he, in his blind, animal panic, lunged. He grabbed her arm. It wasn't a touch. It was a violent, possessive grip, his fingers digging into her bicep. "Elara," he hissed, his voice a strangled whisper. "What is this? What is going on? This is a joke, right? Stop it. Who are you with? What did you do?" His grip was painful. It was the same grip he had used to pull her from a party, the same grip he'd used when he was angry. But the woman he was holding was not the woman he remembered. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry out. She simply stopped and looked down, with a kind of cold, detached disgust, at his white-knuckled hand on her arm. "Mr. Sterling took one half-step forward, his hand moving slightly toward his jacket, a silent, deadly question in his eyes. Elara gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Mine." She raised her eyes, lifting her chin, and locked her gaze with his. Her eyes were not angry, they were not sad, they were as cold, as clear, and as sharp as a shard of glass. "You were always terrible at math, Marcus," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it was clear, and it carried in the dead, tomb-like silence of the room. He stared at her, his face a mask of utter confusion. "What? What are you talking about? Math? This isn't. What does that mean?" "The numbers, Marcus," she said, the chill in her voice making him flinch. "The code, the one thing you never bothered to understand, the one thing you thought was just a tool." He was grasping, his mind spinning, trying to make sense of the impossible. "Elara, stop this. You're with Orion." "How?" I'm in talks with Orion. They're a potential client." "They." A small, cold, and utterly humorless smile touched her lips. "They're not your client, Marcus. And you're not in talks with them. You've been pitching to an empty room. They're my new partners. And they were, in fact, Mr. Vance's one condition for this deal." "What condition?" "That I handle you. Personally." She leaned in, just as he had done to her, but her whisper was not for the room, it was for him. "The original algorithm I built, Marcus, the one that runs your entire company. The engine, the golden goose you stole from me. The one your high-priced lawyers said was just a part of your vision." She watched his eyes widen, the dawning, abject horror finally beginning to seep in. "It had a kill switch," she said. Marcus's face was a mask of utter, blank confusion. His grip on her arm went slack, his fingers still hooked into her cardigan, but all the power was gone. He looked like a man who had been spoken to in a language he did not understand. "Kill switch," he repeated, his voice a dry, hoarse whisper. What? What are you talking about? That's insane. You're lying. Elara felt a cold, final surge of power. He was simple, he thought in simple terms, like an on-off switch, like a bomb. He couldn't even comprehend the elegance of what she had done. Not a switch, Marcus, she said, her voice impossibly calm, as if she were explaining a simple coding problem. That would be too crude. Too obvious. I was always better than that. She looked at him, at the man who had called her a footnote, and she finally, slowly, began to explain the equation that was about to end his life. It was a logic bomb, a piece of brilliant, beautiful, self-executing code buried so deep in the core architecture that your new, high-priced, idiot engineers would never, ever find it. Not in a million years. His eyes were wide, the panic starting to set in. He was still holding her. The original algorithm, my engine, it was tied to a 2-year maintenance key, she continued, her voice as methodical as a metronome. A key that only I possessed. It was a fail-safe, a dead man's switch, to ensure that if I was ever, say, pushed out of my own company, the asset I built would be protected. She watched the blood drain from his face, leaving a sickly, pale gray. The core logic was designed to decay without that key, she stated, her words as sharp and precise as a surgeon's scalpel. It wouldn't just stop. It would corrupt. Slowly, it would start making small mistakes. Data miscalculations, rounding errors, glitches. It would, over time, become obsolete. It would rot from the inside out. She paused, letting the full weight of the revelation land on him. That 2-year mark, Marcus. It passed exactly 6 months ago. He made a small, choking sound. 6 months, she repeated, her voice a whisper of pure, cold steel. Right around the time your stock began to freefall, wasn't it? Right around the time your platform started having those catastrophic glitches you couldn't explain. Right around the time all your clients started screaming. She watched his mind, the mind she had once respected, frantically try to connect the dots. She did it for him. You called Apex Solutions a ghost ship, a new voice, Mr. Sterling's, cut in. He was standing right beside them now, a silent, imposing guardian. Mr. Vance was quoting you. Orion Dynamics had been evaluating your company for a logistics contract. Our technical audit found that your entire platform was, and I quote, a corrupted, worthless, and hollowed-out shell. They pulled their bid, of course. Mr. Vance does not invest in ghost ships. Marcus's entire body was trembling. He was looking at Elara, his eyes now filled with a dawning, abject, and deeply satisfying terror. You, he breathed, his voice cracking. It was you. You did this. You're not here for a celebration, Marcus, Elara said, ignoring his accusation. Her voice was flat, devoid of all emotion. You're not here celebrating a new round of funding. You're here to fly to Aspen to beg a minor investor, a man named David Walsh, for a bridge loan. A bridge loan just to make payroll next week. He recoiled as if she had struck him. He had no idea how she knew that, but she did. Mr. Vance's due diligence had been thorough, and I have some bad news for you, Marcus, she said. He's going to deny you. In fact, Mr. Sterling was kind enough to have a word with him this morning, explaining exactly what Orion Dynamics had discovered. David Walsh pulled his meeting with you 10 minutes ago. Has not even in Aspen. The final pin was pulled. The grenade that was his life, finally, completely, detonated. His face, his perfect, handsome, arrogant face, just collapsed. It caved in on itself, the mask of the visionary, the titan, the husband, melting away to reveal the terrified, weak, and pathetic little boy underneath. He was ruined. He was not just failing. He was finished. His company was an empty shell. His stock was worthless. His funding was gone, and his last hope was a phantom. And the woman he had destroyed, the footnote, was the one holding the signed and notarized death certificate. You bitch, he breathed, the insult a pathetic rattle, all his hatred, his rage, and his terror packed into one impotent word. Jessica, who had been watching this exchange as if it were a foreign movie with no subtitles, finally spoke. Ricky, she whined, her voice shrill. What is she saying? What's going on? Ricky, you're scaring me. Stop it. Marcus didn't even hear her. His eyes were locked on Elara, his expression now changing from terror to a desperate, wild pleading. Elara just looked at him. She felt nothing, no pity, no anger, no triumph, just quiet. The profound, echoing silence of a heavy iron door clanging shut. She reached up, her hand steady, and her fingers slowly, deliberately, unhooked his from her cardigan. His hand fell to his side, limp. You didn't build anything, Marcus, she said, her voice the softest it had been. You just put your name on my foundation. And you forgot that foundations need their architect. She turned her back on him. It was the last time she would ever look at his face. Mr. Sterling, she said, her voice clear and strong. I'd like to go now. I have a signing to get to. Of course, Director Hayes, he said, his face impassive. He gestured toward the glass doors, leading to the tarmac. This way. She took 1 step, 2 steps. Elara. The sound was not his name. It was an animal scream, a raw, ragged, desperate sound that tore through the silent lounge. Elara, wait. You can't just, please. He had lunged, running after her. Elara didn't stop, didn't even pause. She just kept walking. Elara, please. He was sobbing now, his voice cracking. We can fix this. We can be partners again. I'll get rid of her. He waved a frantic, dismissive hand at Jessica. She's nothing. I'll do anything. We can have it back, just like it was. I need you. Those last 3 words, the confession he would have rather died than speak, hung in the air, a pathetic, raw, and final admission. He had always needed her. He was nothing without his engine. He had burst through the glass doors, running onto the tarmac, his $3,000 shoes slipping on the painted lines. An airport security guard was already moving, yelling at him to stop. Elara just kept walking. She walked across the tarmac, the crisp, cold air hitting her face. It smelled like jet fuel and freedom. The whine of the G700's auxiliary power unit was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. It was the sound of her future. A flight attendant was waiting at the bottom of the gleaming aluminum stairs, smiling warmly. Welcome, Director Hayes. It's a pleasure to have you. We have your preferred tea, the Silver Needle, and the briefing for your flight to Geneva ready for you. Thank you, Elara said, her voice steady. She put her foot on the first step. Behind her, she could hear the commotion, the sound of Marcus struggling, of him screaming her name, a desperate, broken wail. She paused, just for a second. She did not turn her head. She looked up, at the massive, pearlescent white tail of her aircraft. She looked at the Orion logo. She thought of the woman who had cried on the floor of a tiny apartment. She thought of the worthless patent. She took the next step. And the next. She walked up the stairs, leaving the sound of her past screaming on the tarmac below. She stepped into the cabin. It was not a plane. It was a cathedral. A vast expanse of cream leather, polished dark wood, and soft, indirect lighting. It was silent, peaceful. The heavy door swung shut behind her, latching with a solid, satisfying, and deeply final thunk. The noise of the tarmac, the sound of the world, the sound of Marcus, was cut off completely. It was over. Elara sank into a seat that felt like a cloud. The flight attendant handed her a warm, damp towel. We are cleared for takeoff, Director Hayes. We should be in the air in 5 minutes. Elara nodded, fastening her seat belt. She looked out the large, oval window. Down on the tarmac, she saw him. A small, defeated, struggling figure, being dragged back into the lounge by 2 security guards. She saw Jessica, standing frozen by the toy Citation jet, her hand over her mouth. Then the massive twin engines of the Gulfstream spooled up, a powerful, deep roar that she felt in her chest. The jet began to move, gliding smoothly away from the FBO. It taxied to the runway, paused for only a moment, and then, with a breathtaking, relentless roar, it accelerated. Elara was pushed back into her seat, a feeling of incredible, smooth power. The plane lifted off the ground, climbing steeply, almost vertically, into the bright, clear blue sky. She watched as New York, then New Jersey, then the entire messy, painful chapter of her past shrank away beneath her. The toy jets, the airport, the man who had tried to break her, all of it became just a pattern, and then it was gone, disappearing forever into the flawless white blanket of the clouds. She was flying toward Geneva. She was flying toward her new company, her new title, and her new, unimaginable wealth. She was flying toward her future, and she was, at last, finally, and completely, free. Elara's story is a testament to the power of silent, focused work and the unshakable truth that real talent can never be stolen, only borrowed. The world may try to call you a footnote, but as she proved, the author always has the last word. What did you think of Elara's ultimate, ice-cold revenge? Do you believe in this kind of karma, where true genius and hard work finally win? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. One time. If you enjoyed this story of justice and resilience, please hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to be reminded of their own power, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories.